Back in the day when Merrick Garland was up for confirmation, they didn't. The senators should do their job now. Once again, they are not. And this is really a sham process and completely politically motivated. And their job, I mean, if you run to be a senator, one of your jobs is to be able to sit and ask questions, which they do in other hearings and contexts. This is the work of committee. And you know, I certainly, regardless of party, would hope and believe that anybody who's elected to serve in the U.S. Senate has the capacity and the competence to frame a question, because it is indeed them who will be voting, and they should be asking the questions.
But we've seen through this process that there's been a certain amount of posturing on both sides. And so one of the arguments, and this was an argument to use attorneys on both sides, was that they may be more directed to the facts as opposed to making
Okay, let's just be clear about what's gone on here.
Okay.
Over the last week, I don't know how many women attorneys in the D.C. area were contacted by staff offices of the Republican senators, desperate to find a woman who would be able to question and do this work. I mean, that is politics, and that is trying to game something. I mean, what should happen here, what you'd want to see in terms of process is anytime there is an allegation like this, and let's remember these are allegations of actual crimes, do what you would hope is always done. Have the FBI and the professionals do an investigation, report that information to the Senate, and let the Senate proceed as it sees fit, consistent with its obligations. It's pretty simple, actually. I mean, even in the context of Anita Hill, they did an FBI investigation. Just from a law enforcement perspective as well, let's be clear about a couple things. One, these are not just allegations of misconduct or sexual harassment. These are actually allegations of a crime. And let's also remember that we are not talking about just any appointment. This is essentially a job interview for Brett Kavanaugh, and it seems to me, certainly as an employer and as I look to hire people, there are extensive background checks and interviews that are done and investigations that are done, and if it ever came up that there were questions about criminal allegations and the like, we would make sure, just as a prospective employer, that we would get to the bottom of that. So I find it remarkable that that we're even having this conversation, because it should be investigated. He should be called to answer questions about these allegations, because it is he who is interviewing for a job. And it's not just any job. This is a job that is a lifetime appointment. And it's not just a lifetime appointment for any job. It is a lifetime appointment where your job is to administer justice, to sit in judgment on cases involving the rights of criminal defendants, of victims, and so many areas of the law. And so, you know, to me, it's even remarkable that we're having this conversation. And I think that we've reached a point, there are any number of qualified candidates out there, qualified judges, who aren't going to bring with them allegations. And now we're talking about multiple allegations just within recent days of what is a serious matter, and that is sexual assault and a crime. And so I've said it's time for Brett Kavanaugh, regardless of what is going on today, to, for the sake of the Supreme Court, let's withdraw from the process. Certainly there should be no vote without a full hearing preceded by a legitimate investigation by law enforcement. But I really almost think we're beyond that. He should just withdraw from this, and they should find another candidate who will sit on the Supreme Court.
Given that Brett Kavanaugh, his remarks about Dr. Ford's statements are that it's not that he disbelieves what he's saying, at least in his statement he's saying that, but that this wasn't me. Is that, and if you know, if somebody's accused of something, and let's just say this person's innocent, should he just withdraw and just... Again,
I don't think anyone is entitled to sit on the Supreme Court, right? This is about selecting somebody for a particular position. And I think that there are any number of qualified candidates out there, in the ranks who are able to fill this and fulfill this responsibility and role. So, look, I think that others will determine and assess the credibility of Brett Kavanaugh. I find some of his statements remarkable in the face of what has been extensively corroborated by people who have no interest in political outcomes, and by information that was recorded years ago by even some who are his friends. So, I just find it remarkable that we're even having this conversation, and we need a Supreme Court that people can believe in, have faith in, regardless of political views. But one thing that cannot give way is people's faith in the justices as being fair and neutral arbiters of justice, people who can come to that position and be ready to apply the law, conduct themselves in a way that inspires integrity. And right now, a Justice Kavanaugh, regardless of the outcome of this proceeding, is never going to inspire that faith or integrity as we go forward, and that's a disservice to the court, and it's a disservice to the role of judiciary in our system. And that's why I say, find another candidate.
Do you think that Donald Trump can come up with a candidate that the Democrats might find acceptable?
Sure. There was a whole list of candidates, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So I'd go back to the process there.
Some of whom are even more conservative than Kavanaugh.
Hey, you know what? I'm of the view elections have consequences,
Mm-hmm.
and if you win an election, you're allowed to go through and make those nominations, and ultimately the Senate has the job to review that and to vote. I think it is a shame that didn't happen in the context of Merrick Garland, where he was held up for so many months. But I don't think, I do think that elections matter, and there should be a process, and we shouldn't deviate from that process. And I'm sure there are any number of qualified candidates who can sit on the Supreme Court.
In terms of the FBI investigation,
I may not agree with their positions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, but you know what? That's
Mm-hmm.
that's life.
In terms of the FBI investigation, Dianne Feinstein could have started one before the hearings, or could she have started one before the hearings started? Because she had the letter, and therefore, said, look, we need to include this in the investigation.
Yeah, no one senator, and certainly not a ranking minority member, can authorize or order the FBI to initiate an investigation. That was not within her power or control.
But she could have gone to the committee and said to to the Republican chairman, and said, look, we've got this letter, and this needs to be part of the investigation before the hearings even started, so that it would have been right up front.
Well, I think the important thing is that it's happened to date,
Mm-hmm.
and I think look at how well it's been received
Mm-hmm.
by the Senate Republicans. I can only imagine how it might have been received any earlier. I don't think it would have been received any differently, frankly. The important thing is it's out now, and I think that listening to Dr. Ford testify this morning, she was very clear about her reservations and her concern in coming forward, and that certainly had an impact on the timing of all of this. And just to listen to her, I was incredibly moved and taken with how direct and clear she was about all of this.
The one thing that it might have done is mitigated any contention by the Republicans that this is a last minute.
Isn't it more important to get it right? Whether it happened 3 weeks ago,
Mm-hmm.
whether it happened 8 weeks ago, whether it's happening now. Again, we're talking about a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court, where your job is to sit in judgment, to administer justice. It is incredibly important that you get it right. And that is exactly why there needs to be an investigation of the allegations that have surfaced, and a thorough opportunity for questioning and vetting, which is the role of the Senate through this confirmation process. That's what's important, I think, to get it right.
Can I get
I'm
you,
sorry. Go
guys,
ahead.
I'd like to back up. I wanted to let people on Facebook Live know where we are and what we're doing. We're at the Worcester Telegram. I'm Ann Brennan, the editor-in-chief of the Metro West Daily News, and Anthony Similardis, who was in the shot a few minutes ago, is the editorial page editor for the Worcester Telegram. And there's other members of the Worcester Telegram staff here to ask the Attorney General some questions.
Ann, do you have any questions you wanted to jump in with?
I was wondering about, in the Democratic contest for the Middlesex DA's race, the unsuccessful candidate was really pushing getting more data from the criminal justice system, looking at collecting data from police, from the courts, from the DA's offices to make sure, well, to identify areas that the justice system has inequities and then to address them. Do you have any plans to do a similar thing at the state? I mean, the winning, Marion Ryan did win that nomination. She said she hopes to pursue that. I'm wondering if there's any effort at the state level to do similar.
I think it's a good conversation to have. I think data is always important. Information is always important because it helps drive effective strategies, effective policy making. So I'm always in the camp of more data is better, more knowledge is better. I think that's something to take up and consider. And it's not something that my office alone could drive or initiate. Obviously, there's work that individual cities and towns are responsible for and do. There's also the role of the Executive Office of Public Safety within the Baker administration. But I do think that data as a general matter, more data the better, because that will hopefully drive more effective strategies, more effective allocation of resources, and ultimately a better process that's going to result in a fairer and more just and more effective criminal justice system when we're talking about data collection in that context.
And one of the things that they are talking about also is bail reform in general. There's been so many cases of people who have been released on bail and then commit crime. There's also been cases of people who have kind of a level of bail that essentially ruins their life, and because they're poor essentially. How does a law enforcement, or lawyers and judges balance the risk to the community against the resources and giving a fair bail to somebody who's accused of a crime?
Well, there's new criminal justice reform legislation that was signed into law earlier this year by Governor Baker that actually addresses some issues of bail reform. So that's got to be implemented. And then within the courts, there is a role for judges, of course, in applying and following the law. It's pretty clear about what is permitted when you're looking at whether or not somebody is to receive bail and what the conditions should be. And prosecutors' offices around the state must follow that. But I think these are important questions, and obviously they turn on the facts and circumstances of any individual case, but that's the way our system works.
Maura, the governor tweeting just about an hour ago, I don't know if you saw it, but the accusations brought against Judge Kavanaugh are sickening and deserve an independent investigation. There should be no vote in the Senate. What do you make of that tweet from our Republican governor, and can you talk a little bit about the line he has to walk being a Republican governor, and the pushback he's been willing to give the Trump administration and some of the national Republicans? Do you think he's gone far enough? Would you like to see him go further?
Well, I'll leave that to pundits and others in the business to judge. I will tell you that I do think that at this point, with respect to the hearings of Brett Kavanaugh, it's sad that it's gotten to this point. I think he should have withdrawn already, and I think that the Senate should be in a position to evaluate a new set of candidates for the position. But obviously we'll see how today and tomorrow go. And look, I've been sorely disappointed in what I have seen from the Republican Party for the last couple of years now, and the unwillingness and the spinelessness and the lack of courage of so many, particularly in Congress, to stand up and to stand up for basic principles, the Constitution, civil rights, the rule of law, in the face of pretty unimaginable things we've seen from our president the last couple of years. And I would have liked to have seen and would like to see more leadership from Republicans in Congress, And I'm dismayed by the lack of leadership there. I do think it's really important in Massachusetts that we lead as a state. Right now, I think people across this country are looking to cities and states for leadership, because it's not coming out of Washington, D.C. and the federal government. And I think we need strong and effective leaders who work together at all levels, but particularly state and local right now, to be able to move us forward to get things done.
You were a opponent of the marijuana legalization, and I wanted to ask how you thought, because there have been some controversies locally about the implementation of the law. I wondered if you had any opinions about how the rollout of not just what the voters approved, but what the legislature then went in and adjusted.
This is a new area, new industry, and I guess a few things. I recognize my role as Attorney General is to implement the law, implement the will of the voters. Even though I personally didn't support legalization of recreation, I still have a lot of concerns, particularly about things like the fact that we don't have a way to test for impairment now of those who are smoking marijuana and out driving. But the day-to-day work in my office really, Tony, has been on, in the first instance, reviewing proposed bylaws. As you know, we have a statutory obligation as an office to review bylaws proposed by towns. We've had a lot proposed by towns over the last couple of years on this issue specifically, and also to be there to make appointments to the Cannabis Commission, which we've done. I want to make sure that the new law is implemented effectively and efficiently, but I expect there to be some bumps along the way as things get sorted out. One of the things I was concerned about and have been concerned about is the fact that this has essentially been a cash industry, because the federal government has said we don't allow for marijuana sales. That's against federal law, so you can't bank through federally insured institutions.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem if it then creates this cash industry. As a general matter, those of us in law enforcement don't love cash industries, right? There are problems associated with an all-cash industry. So recently I heard news that one of our credit unions is willing to bank. That's important, that the right structures be set up. But I think it points to the fact that this is a new industry, and we're going to have to work through some issues here.
There's this just interesting dichotomy that the legislature set up, where how you voted back 2 years ago is dictating the process that you take in terms of allowing or not allowing recreational marijuana facilities to open in your community. Right. And it just, do you think that's constitutional, that they can do that and say this vote you took 2 years ago now dictates what you can do and can't do? Because I believe it's caused a lot of problems.
Well, I actually, I do think it's probably constitutional. You may not like it, or you may think there's a better way to go about it, but it's the law. It's the way this system has been set up. And I think it's worked pretty well. My office has approved the vast majority of bylaws that are doing things to further and support the law. There have been some bylaws that were approved that delayed or continued a moratorium. Part of that has been working out with cities and towns in particular, how long it was going to take for them to get before town meeting or the planning board on certain rezoning approvals and the like. So I think it's worked out pretty well so far. Have there been some bumps? Yes. My office, for example, I think we got it wrong with one of our initial bylaws. We had to go back and redo that, but again, my job is to make sure we get it right, and if we didn't get it right, then to go back and make sure we get it right. But it's certainly generated a lot of work for a lot of cities and towns, and it's just going to be one of those things that we're going to continue to need to work through, and we got to work with the law as it's drafted.
And you've already extended the amount of time that communities can have to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to do this?
We have in the past, although many of those deadlines have already passed, and now towns are on to implementation right now. So That's why I say I think if you look across the state in terms of actual implementation, what's opening, what's slated to open, I think that things are moving in the right direction there. Are there some towns that are still sorting that out? Recently we had a town come before us and ask for a little bit more time, not so that they could delay and say, we want to keep marijuana industry, cannabis industry out of our town for as long as possible. Rather, they come to us asking for approval of a bylaw to delay so that their planning board, their zoning commission can actually do what they want to do to facilitate and rezone so that the industry can go forward there. So, we're in this state right now of trying to work with cities and towns, work through these issues, but my job is to make sure that we're implementing effectively and expeditiously.
There's also the question of towns holding up people who want to come in to get more from them than what's statutorily required. But also, I've gotten the impression that there are people out there offering communities a lot more, saying, if we come in here, here's what we'll do for you. We'll build you a new fire station or things like that. Have you encountered that, and what your
I've heard of that, I've read some of the reporting on that. Look, this is big business. This is big industry. There's a lot of money to be made, a lot at stake there. I think that those are really determinations and discussions between individual cities and towns and those seeking approvals. It's not something that is necessarily before my office, nor do I necessarily think it creates a legal issue, but I think it's an issue for how and what kind of relationship cities and towns want to have with what will be a business in their district.
Charlton has had a particularly contentious situation,
Yes.
including some questions of open meeting law violations. Have those been brought to your attention, and are you?
Well, interestingly, Charlton was before our office with a couple of proposed bylaws that we ultimately approved. One was a bylaw to ban the industry altogether, which, consistent with other rulings from our office, there are constitutional ways to do that, and so we approved that bylaw. There was also a proposed bylaw that dealt with some of the zoning to allow it to go forward, and that also was constitutionally sound, so we approved that. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the voters in Charlton to decide what they want to do. But certainly with respect to open meeting law violations, bylaw review work that we've done. But open meeting law is something that our office takes seriously. We enforce. We've been hard at that for a few years now. I have a division of open government that was set up new in my time to both deal with issues of public records and also open meeting law obligations.
Okay. And speaking of what you find constitutional or not, have you looked back at what happened to the fair share, or the so-called millionaire's tax, in terms of, because it seemed like there were a lot of people counting on that revenue, and all of a sudden it evaporated, or the opportunity evaporated. So what, in terms of your view, what specifically happened where the Supreme Judicial Court said that no, this doesn't meet the requirement?
Well, I'm sorry we lost that. We lost that case. There was a constitutional challenge to that amendment. My office reviewed it, approved it as believing that it was constitutionally sound. We knew there were legal questions with it. We knew that this was going to be a close call for the courts, but looking at the law, looking at the facts, in our judgment, we thought it was something that was constitutional and that the voters should have the right to vote on. Unfortunately, in a divided SJC decision, and remember that was a divided decision, we ended up on the other side of that, and so some of the justices by vote, I think it was 5-3, decided that this was close, decided that it was not constitutional and should not go before the voters. I think what we'll see as we go forward, this will come up again, and because there is going to continue to be a need to address real revenue issues here in the state as you think about transportation and infrastructure and education.
Mhm.
So we try our best to get it right when it comes to the law. I still think we got it right here. I disagree with where the SJC came out in its decision, but obviously I don't get to decide the law. I only get to enforce the law, and the SJC has spoken for now.
We have 3 referendum questions coming up in November, and the first question: your mother was a nurse, so what's your take on this conflict that's going on, and regarding the setting of at least minimum standards for nursing staffing versus hospitals saying that, you know, we understand what our staffing is, it shouldn't be dictated.
Right. You've done your homework. My mom was a nurse, my grandmother was a nurse, my great aunt was a nurse. I wasn't going to be, I was afraid of blood. But I'll tell you, nurses work incredibly hard, do great work. I think any of us who've had family members in a hospital or under care appreciate the hard work of nurses. I think all of us also appreciate what's happening in the state, with healthcare costs too. So I think this is an issue that deserves the robust debate it's having and airing out, and people need to read and learn more. I'm waiting to see too on what looks to be a report coming from our Health Policy Commission in the next few weeks. So we'll be looking at that and assessing that as we go forward. But obviously, this is a space where AG's office, we have a particular role in healthcare, and are working hard and looking closely at issues, particularly as they relate to people's ability to access quality care.
And you had a question.
Right,
about
question
one of the
3,
questions.
which, as I understand it, will repeal the current law that makes it illegal to discriminate against transgender young people and adults in places like restrooms, hotels, stores, restaurants, and restrooms. If the voters reject question 3, and do you see a role for yourself in protecting transgender rights or in discrimination against transgender Massachusetts citizens?
Yeah, look, this question is about whether we're going to change existing law, whether we're going to take away an existing civil right. And from a law enforcement perspective, I think it's very important that we keep this law in place to protect people's civil rights, to protect public safety, because what we know through law enforcement work is the real vulnerabilities that transgender people, young people and older people face, and their safety concerns. This is an instance where there's a particular group that wants to come into Massachusetts and take away an important law that is there to protect against discrimination and to protect public safety. And so I just think as a matter of law enforcement, it's why that law, when it was being proposed a few years ago and working through, had the support of police, district attorneys, and really all of us in law enforcement, in addition to those who were supporting the need to make sure that our city hall, our movie theaters, our newspapers, or any place, restaurants, bars, be a place that everybody in the state has the ability to visit, to patronize, and that and not be discriminated against. And unfortunately, over time, we saw too many reports of people who were kicked out or refused service simply because of their gender identity. And the legislature saw fit, and Governor Baker signed into law an important public accommodations bill to protect civil rights, and that's something that I think must stand.
Do you think the question is confusingly written? Because you read it, and it's like you're not really sure what you're voting for.
I think those who are looking to take Massachusetts backwards and take away a civil right wrote the question in a way that was to their favor. So, it could be written differently. It makes it more of a challenge, I think, for those of us who want to make sure that the law stays in place and that we have civil rights protections for people. But part of that is, a need to educate the public that voting yes means actually keeping in place the status quo, which may be counterintuitive to people.
Yeah.
We're not looking to add a right, add a benefit, add a protection. We're looking to hold the line and make sure we don't take away a benefit or a protection. And I think what you've seen through this is not just civil rights advocates or members of the LGBT community in support, or law enforcement, because we know they're very real numbers. It's transgender people who are assaulted and beat up in places, including places of public accommodation that need the protection. We've also seen the business community, and all of our major professional sports teams, so many of our major corporations in Massachusetts have joined together to say, this kind of law is important. It's something that we as employers are obligated to respect, and similarly we think that it should be the rule when it comes to places of public accommodation generally. And I think that's been an important voice in sort of pointing out what this is all about.
But voting no takes away that right.
Takes away,
in the
changes
case
the
of
law.
Bathrooms, locker rooms, and that sort of thing. It doesn't affect the whole law. At least I don't think so.
Well, it doesn't affect employment or housing or education, but it affects public accommodations. And the opponents of this, the opponents of this civil right, this protection for transgender people, want to describe this all and cast this all as a bathroom bill. It's not a bathroom bill, okay? It's not a locker room bill.
Okay.
It's about whether somebody can walk into the Telegram right now and be kicked out and said, we're not going to take your complaint, we're not going to sit and talk with you because you're transgender. It's about whether or not somebody can get kicked out of a restaurant and refuse service, or kicked out of a movie theater, or whether a police officer can refuse to take a complaint or deal with them, because they don't like how this person is dressed or how they appear, and have questions about about them, and that's what this is about. So understand, as I do, that the opponents have long made this a game about bathrooms, with really misleading ads that are out there, and I'm sure that will come, about what's happening in bathrooms and locker rooms. And from a law enforcement perspective, the public safety statistics are quite clear. There are no reports out there, here or anywhere across the country, of people dressing up and perpetrating crimes against young girls or women in bathrooms under the guise of transgender.
In fact, I think a study was just
It's
released.
Just the opposite, actually.
And a study was just released on communities that had done it in advance.
Yeah, and people should remember, a few years ago now, this civil right protection was put in place for people renting apartments or trying to get a mortgage, saying you couldn't discriminate against somebody based on their gender identity. It was put in place for schools, saying you needed to make sure that students weren't getting discriminated, and for employers too, that you couldn't discriminate based on gender identity in the same way you can't discriminate based on religion or race or gender. And guess what? We haven't heard. I mean, it's been implemented, and the only thing that I think has really happened is that now, members of the transgender community, in particular parents of transgender kids, feel like their kid can grow up in a world that is safer and in a situation where their kid's going to be protected. That's really, really important, and that's what this is about. If we're going to have those protections in place in schools, in employment contexts, and housing, then we should make sure we hold ourselves accountable as places of public accommodation open to the public.
Do you know if the Framingham School District worked with your office? They were the first one to implement accommodation for sports for athletes, and I'm just wondering if they dealt with your office at all.
I'd have to get back to you on that. We do have a lot of conversations back and forth with schools and with districts as they're trying to implement laws. They come to us for guidance and assistance sometimes. We've done a lot of trainings, including civil rights trainings, and I know my office has done a lot of trainings on raising sort of awareness and educating about civil rights and transgender rights too.
Last question for this Facebook portion, if that's okay.
Sure.
And maybe I've missed this, but since the Pennsylvania investigation of the Catholic Church landed. It was like a bomb, similar to what happened in Massachusetts when the Globe came out with its report. And since then, you've had New York and New Jersey Attorney Generals saying that they're going to run an investigation in their state, and I think 4 other states have indicated that they're going to do the same thing. Are you looking into this to do a similar investigation? Because you did have priests arrested and sentenced, but in terms of hierarchy being held accountable for what's happened, that hasn't happened in Massachusetts.
We're looking at this very closely. Of course, Massachusetts is a little differently situated than New York or Pennsylvania, where many years ago, based on the strength of tremendous investigative reporting and journalism, significant investigation and actions were taken here in Massachusetts. You may remember Attorney General Tom Riley's investigation and report, and I'll tell you, as part of that, what flowed were new protocols and policies set up, ensuring things like ready communication and reporting of allegations from any archdiocese to, for example, local law enforcement. In the wake of A.G. Shapiro's report, which was devastating and so important, we reached out immediately to our law enforcement partners to discuss the extent to which there has been reporting on of any allegations. We continue to talk about that, and I think that everybody needs to take a hard look at whether or not more training is needed. Certainly any allegation brought to light in my jurisdiction we will take seriously and investigate, but I think it speaks to a broader issue that still exists about culture right now within the church, and really directly one coming from the Vatican and Rome, that there are serious questions there. I don't think the church is taking this seriously enough around the world, and that needs to be addressed. And certainly, law enforcement is an important part of that, but it's going to require more than law enforcement to change what has been a terribly debilitating and degrading and dehumanizing culture with so many victims in its wake.
Mm-hmm. So your department is looking at the feasibility or possibility or need for this sort of investigation in Massachusetts? Well,
I think sure, but I do want to be clear. Some of the work that is being done now in Pennsylvania and New York is equivalent to what was already done here in Massachusetts years ago, following the investigative reports of media and journalists. So I think that's a very good thing that examination is now taking place in other states, but certainly we're keeping everything open and on the table here in Massachusetts, so that we're taking steps to both address and hold accountable perpetrators of sexual violence, sexual assault, but also preventing it. And making sure that the right practices, trainings, policies are in place to ensure that this doesn't happen again and doesn't continue.
In terms of, prospectively.
Well, you have to do both.
Yeah,
you have to hold those accountable. It's incredibly important. It's incredibly important for a host of reasons. Certainly for the accountability that victims and survivors deserve, and to make sure you get rid of those perpetrators and put them where they should be, which is in prison,
Or in some cases, document enablers who may have suffered no consequences or no recognition for what they did.
Exactly. Okay. It's that, but it also has to be about what is happening right now in the church here and around the world to make sure that culture is changed, that this end, and that anybody who is part of perpetrating these crimes or covering up these crimes is held accountable.
Okay. Are you all set, Ann? Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. This has been the conclusion of our Facebook Live presentation. The conversation will continue here, so make sure you catch the Telegram stories online as well as in print tomorrow, and we'll have this video as well. Thank you.
Terrific.